All right. Well, let's start. Good evening. I'm Wayne Prentice from the Rochester chapter of the Image Science Technology Professional Society. And I'm here tonight with Pat Cosgrove, um, who is going to give us a presentation. It's going to be a little unusual in this presentation. We're going to start with a video, and it's going to be a tour of his observatory, which obviously we can't do live. So that's pre-recorded, following which there's an interview portion where Pat describes his journey and how he got to where he is now. So we're going to play that. First, I'd like to introduce Pat Cosgrove, let him say a couple words. We'll play the video. It goes on for about 40 minutes, which is shorter than most of our programs. And then afterwards, we have a discussion with Pat, what you've seen, and we'll call it a night. So let me introduce Pat Cosgrove.
Hi, thanks very much for the invitation today. And I have to say, I gave a talk to this group a little over a year ago, where I talked about doing my astrophotography from my driveway, which I did for about 4 solid years. And it was rather awkward and time consuming. I decided there had to be a better way. So I started plotting to build an observatory, which turned out to be more of an effort than I thought, since it involved moving to a new location. But that process is done. And when Wayne contacted me about doing another talk for the observatory, I had just completed it. We'd had a lot of delays because of weather, but we just completed it. And I'm really going to enjoy this talk myself because in this talk, I won't be talking. Wayne showed up with a truck full of video toys, did all of the video capture, sound capture, and has done all the production work that's gone into it. So this is a very strange situation to be here for a talk where I won't really be talking. It'll really be Wayne's work and what he captured and shared. So he deserves a lot of the credit. Or if it's not very good, I'll make sure that goes his way too. But I've seen it, so I think it came out really well. And with that, I'll let Wayne go ahead.
All right. Thanks for that hearty endorsement. Let me cue up the video here just a second. Hi, I'm Wayne Prentice from the Rochester chapter of the Society of Image Science and Technology. I'm working on a film here put together from some captures I did yesterday. I went on a tour to visit Pat Cosgrove. If you remember Pat Cosgrove, he gave us a presentation last year about capturing images from his driveway. He's since then moved to a new location, and he's built an observatory to put his equipment, and this presentation is about his new observatory, the Whispering Skies. Before we play this, I think it'd be important to give you some context. When you think about somebody capturing pictures from their driveway, you may imagine some fuzzy pictures of Jupiter, certainly not the stuff you'd see from the Hubble telescope. Well, to give us some context, I'd like to run through a slideshow of some of the images Pat has captured. It gives you an example of what happens when you take somebody who's got a deep background in image science, combine it with his hobby and tenacity, and going through the experience that he's been through. He's captured some amazing images. So let's start with a slideshow of images, give some context to the kind of things he's captured. Again, these were done from his driveway, his previous location, and we very much look forward to see what he's going to get from his new Whispering Pines Observatory, which we will get a tour of right after this. I'm here today standing in front of this rather unusual building. Well, to learn more about this building, I'd like to introduce Pat Cosgrove, owner and creator of Cosmos, and the person responsible for this structure. And he's going to teach us more about it.
Well, welcome, Wayne, to Whispering Skies Observatory. This has been kind of a labor of love for me for the last 3 years. We just finished the construction phase, and we've installed the equipment in. And so we now have a fully functioning astrophotography observatory.
Oh, great. I can't wait to see more of it.
Let's take a look.
Great.
This is the business end of the observatory. So maybe I could say a few words about the observatory building itself first. One subtle design detail you may have picked up on, this is called a roll-off roof design. The roof actually is designed to roll off the building as it is now. The advantage of this kind of a design is that I can have multiple telescopes, each pursuing their own targets independently, whereas a lot of traditional observatories have a dome in one slot, and they can only point in one direction at one point. So that's the idea behind this particular. The building itself is 16 foot by 20. The telescope side of the building is 16 by 16. And there's been an extension over here. In the future, this will have a counter and cabinets for storage and a small workshop. That's a summer project, but that's the room allocated for that. The walls are 7 foot high. They're designed to be this height so that no matter what position the telescopes are pointing, should weather conditions change and I need to protect them, the roof is designed to close over them without hitting the telescopes, which is a good feature. And that really helps with the safety. The method of construction we used here was kind of a pole barn method, where we're using these engineered columns, which have concrete that are going down into the foundation, heavy-duty poles that hold the load, and then on top we have a 4x4 steel beam that runs on the east-west wall and on the north wall. That brings rigidity to the building, and that extends to the back of the building with a framework which actually holds the roof when you roll it off. And right now we have 2 windows on the front of the observatory. They have no functionality as far as the observatory goes. They're made for aesthetics so that when it's seen from the house, my wife will like it. So right now we just have blackout curtains. I'm sort of taking those down. The foundation was fairly elaborate because each of these telescopes has to have a very solid mounting. So each telescope has a 24-inch column of concrete that goes down below the frost line, 42 inches, bolts coming up from that, and these custom steel piers that I had made bolt onto that. The slab floor is poured in such a way that it's at the bottom of the floor is actually 1 inch higher than the foundation for the piers. This allows these piers to be completely isolated from the building. Should the wind blow on the walls, cause a vibration that transmits through the floor, it will not bother the telescopes. They're completely independent. On each wall where we have these steel beams, there's a track system. And on the west wall here, there is a V track. You can't quite see it, but there's a V track. And we'll have some wheels we'll look at on the track system there, which are V, so that it engages in a positive way. And that guides the movement of the roof back and forth. On this wall, we have a slightly different arrangement. The track here is completely flat, and the wheels are completely flat. And the idea here is if you had 2 V wheels on V track, you could over-constrain the situation. And we wanted to make sure that we didn't have that. So the flat track versus the V track is pretty much how things are tied together. In order for the observatory to be functional, I have to have power and I have to have internet. And to do that, we had to bring power from the house, which is 180 feet away. We brought in a 100 amp service, which basically allows me to do almost anything I'd ever have to do in terms of power use for the observatory. And the way it's distributed, we have power that's run to each of the piers. So each telescope has a source of electricity to power what it's doing. We also have outlets on each of the 4 walls. There are more outlets on this wall, since this is where the countertop and the cabinets will be. This is a workspace. And finally, over here, we have a dedicated heavy-duty line, which is feeding up to a motor system, which is actually what drives the roof open and closed. And the control system for that can be seen over here. Okay, so with this control system, I can manually open and close the roof anytime I want, but it also offers a software driver so that I can do this under automation. In addition, another aspect of this particular system that I like is I can purchase a weather system, which I have and I will be mounting in the future. So that actually watches the conditions in the sky, and should something come in overnight, which was unanticipated, it can close the roof until the clouds go by or the rain stops or the wind dies down, and open things up again and allow the telescopes to continue doing what they're doing. So that's the control system. The other aspect here is I needed to have solid Wi-Fi so that all the equipment can tie into the internet. So when we brought in all the panels or all the wires from the house for the service, we also brought in redundant Ethernet cables from the house. I have a mesh router here, and it's using that Ethernet as the backhaul, hardwired backhaul component for the mesh. So I have very good coverage for Wi-Fi, very fast service. So every one of these telescopes and the computer, which handles the actual observatory itself, is all connected to the internet. So I can control it remotely. I control it from my house. And in fact, that's what normally happens. I start things up, and then I work from the house. And while that's going on, I have security cameras on 4 corners of the house, which allow me to observe what the equipment is doing and even listen to it. Because sometimes when things go bad, they make bad sounds, and you want to hear that, and you want to be able to control things. So the security cameras give me eyes and ears that allow me to, work through that. When the roof is closed, you have to worry about whether some wind is going to tear it off. And right now, how I handle that is some manual clamps that I bought the clamps and had them modified so that these can actually come up and lock onto 4 corners of the roof and pull this down. These are very strong, and it gives a very positive lockdown, so we've had no problems with wind whatsoever. Now the telescopes look quite different in a lot of ways, but they're all designed to do something slightly differently. This is a Williams optic 132 millimeter refractor. That's an f5.5 optical system, about 740 millimeters of focal length. This is the first scope I ever got, and this is kind of where I started. And I bought this because I thought it would give me a simpler way to get into astrophotography, because refractors are sealed systems. I didn't have to worry about exotics of mirror alignments and things like that. But it's been a really good workhorse for me. And I'm still using the CM60 drive mount, which has been an extremely reliable high-performance drive. So this will actually counteract the turn of the earth, and that allows everything to be precise. And at the same time, there's a secondary scope on here with a secondary camera, and it's looking at the stars and making sure they're not moving in the field of view. If the mount is messing up and they're starting to drift a little bit, it actually talks to the mount and says, get back on track, and fixes it. So this is a secondary system which is managing the tracking of the telescope, so you get a really good result coming out. So this was my first telescope, and it was not inexpensive, and I didn't think I would be getting another telescope for a long time. And setting up the tracking on this there's free software, which is very sophisticated, but it gives you a lot of choices on what algorithms you use and how you correct for drift that's seen, what kind of signals you're going to send back. And so everybody sort of rolls their own way of controlling their scopes with that software. It's one of those learning curve things. There's standard values you can use, and then there's other things you can do that optimize the tracking even further. About 3 months after I bought this scope, I was selling some camera lenses to help pay for this scope, and a person who bought a lens happened to mention to me that he had this guy. And this is an Astrophysics 130 millimeter f8.35 refractor. Astrophysics have phenomenal reputations as high contrast, wonderful systems. He offered to sell me everything he had on it for a ridiculous price, and my wife said, yes, you have to take that, which is always a good thing. So I suddenly had my second telescope. In a lot of ways, it's very similar. It has the same basic drive mount. It has another telescope on, which is acting as the guide scope. It has a camera on the back. This is the longest focal length I had for a long time. It was about 1080 millimeters. And so this was what I used to call my galaxy scope. When you're going after very small objects that need more magnification, this would be the scope that I would end up using for it. A little bit slow, but the optics are so high contrast and so precise that it just does beautiful imaging. Some of my best images have come off this particular telescope. After having these two scopes, at one point it looked like I might have to do some remote imaging as we were visiting family in a remote location. So my wife told me I should go ahead and create a portable scope. So I created this little fellow. Now this is a 400 millimeter astrograph. It's an ASCAR FRA 400. It's because it's 400 millimeter, it covers a much bigger chunk of the sky. It's nice for summer objects that can be very large. And it's very small, and it's sitting on top of a wave strain technology mount. These are new. Every mount that's ever been done, it seems, in the past has been a worm gear with a drive gear. And that's how it tracks the sky. This technology is the same technology they use like for driving the wheels on the rovers for the Apollo missions. It's a very different technology, but it allows you to handle a load without needing a counterweight. It has much torque on it. So it's very lightweight and does an exceptionally good job. So between these three scopes, basically this scope and this scope, this one covers about twice the angle covered is about half the size of what this covers. And this falls right in between. So with those three scopes, when I have an object, I have to decide which telescope is the best in order to get the best results. And I try to match them up. But we're in springtime now, which is galaxy season. It's a time when you see lots of small galaxies in the sky. And they're so small, you really need something with a little bit more focal length. And with our sky conditions, about the largest focal length you can use before the atmosphere smears things out and you lose detail is about 1300. So this last edition is now my new galaxy scope. This is a 10-inch diameter Sharp Star SEA 260 astrograph. It's 1300 millimeters in focal length, but it's a fast f5 system, and it's very crisp right to the edge of the field. So this is a very interesting new telescope for me, and I'm still, frankly, learning how to use it. I just got my first images. I'm processing from it right now, but it's a much bigger telescope, so I should be able to get more detail from it. It has a little bit heavier duty mount than what's seen on the others, but basically all these work in a very similar fashion. There are lots of components on it that work together to solve the problems which make astrophotography hard, and then they're controlled by software which, through automation, manages that process and can run all night. And there are times when I'm doing targets, these will run from dark to sunrise, and I may do it for several nights gathering data to get enough data to make these very faint objects look good when it's time to process them. Part of the thing that really helps them is the new generation cameras. This one, and this one are using mono cameras, latest generation sensors. They have quantum efficiencies of nearly 90%, so they're very, very efficient. They're mono cameras, so all the filters are stored in these little filter wheels here. And I can dial in broadband filters like traditional red, green, and blue imaging, or I can do narrowband filters that are only very sharp cuts, maybe 3 nanometers wide, where I can line them up with certain gaseous clouds you tend to find in nebulae in our galaxy, and they emit light at a very specific frequency, and these take very tiny slices around that and create technical images, false color images, that can be spectacular, especially in areas where there's a lot of star formation forming, where gas clouds and dust are coalescing, forming stars, and the stars are hot UV emitters, and they excite the gas, and the gas shines in its own light. And that's the nice thing. The other thing that's really interesting is you can actually capture a subject with both sets of filters. So you can do some very interesting imaging by using multispectral approaches for that.
Do you find those narrowband filters a nice hedge against light pollution?
Excellent. We have a certain amount of light pollution here towards the north, and it really does a great job of cutting them back. But the design of the observatory, I suppose another thing I should mention is the roof is aligned with a north-south axis. And when I look to the north, I'm looking directly towards the city of Rochester, and it has a significant light dome. And there's a lot of trees behind the observatory which block the view, and that's not a bad thing because I'm never going to image in that light dome because there's too much light pollution there. But the nice thing about that is because Polaris is there and the dome of the sky rotates around it, those things that might be low in the light dome, if I wait 6 months later, they rotate around the sky with the seasons. Now they're high in the sky, they're out of the light dome, and I can still image them.
So it's not a matter of if, but when.
It's a matter of strategic timing, right? So, every observatory site has its trade-offs. One is my location to Rochester, and another is there's some trees here that are on other people's property, and they frown if I go over and cut them down. And even some of our trees here, my wife frowns if I cut them down. So I have to work around it. But we did do a lot of extensive work to trim trees and remove trees. And I have a relatively open sky. In my old location, I had a 3-hour window between 2 sets of trees. Here, I can take an object and go all night long. And that's a wonderful, wonderful degree of freedom and really helps with, the whole imaging experience for what I'm trying to do. Now, instead of waiting for 4 or 5 clear days in Rochester, clear nights in Rochester, which almost never happen, in 1 or 2 nights, I can get all the data I'd ever need to do a decent looking image processing job. Okay, now we've wandered outside the observatory and we've kind of gotten to the backside. This is the north side of the observatory with the roof open. But with this situation, you can really see how the roof was constructed and what the mechanisms are that allow the roof to open. So if you look up, you can see that we have a pretty lightweight roof. It's scissor trusses. There's an insulation blanket, and then it's basically a metal roof. So we wanted this to be as lightweight as it could be. That facilitates our ability to move it. And then when we move it, we have to move it with a motor. And you can just see the top of the motor over here, and you can see a drive gear, which is engaging this linear gear here. And that's the real mechanism which allows this roof to open. There's a 4x6 engineered beam, which goes all the way down on the west side, and that linear track engages the motor and allows the roof to go open and closed. We put it on this side because that's where the maximum torque is, but that's also where we have these V-wheels engaging the V-track, and that's most solid contact, so this is a good place to have that kind of torque. Now, this track is in sections and is bolted on, and since it's bolted into wood, over time one would expect that it could shrink and change dimension a little bit. But these are slots, and we can loosen them and align them. What we don't want is the gear to pull away from the drive wheel. So I have these custom steel cams behind it. And once we get the track where we want it, I can rotate the cam so it's in contact with the back of the track, and I can tighten it down. Now there's no way this track is going to pull away from the drive gear. So that makes it pretty solid. With the roof open, you can also see the actual wheels that are distributed. And there's a group of wheels that go all the way down, and they're sitting on top of a V-track right up in here, which is actually welded right onto the top of this beam. And on this side, we have the V-track. On this side over here, we have the flat track, and you can see it. This is just flat cast wheels. More than we really need to handle the weight load. And we have a stainless steel flat track, which is on the top. These 4x4 beams go all the way back, and they have very heavy-duty cross-bracing going on here. This is probably overkill, but the original design called for 1/8-inch thick steel beams, and we ended up getting 1/4-inch, so very heavy-duty. So between that thickness and this amount of bracing, this is extremely solid, and so holding the roof and holding it stable and not changing over time should be something we can handle pretty well.
All right. And action. Hang on. So, Pat, how did you get started in astrophotography?
Well, I've always had an interest in astronomy. I mean, as a kid, and even as a young guy. So in 2019, I retired. And I said, okay, now I'm going to see what this is all about. I haven't even looked at what the gear looks like. Well, I realized when I was doing astronomy before, film-based imaging was a nightmare. And I saw what was people were doing with digital cameras and dedicated astro cameras. And I said, yeah, I've got all this image science background experience at Kodak. This will make it easy to jump in and learn this stuff. And, astrophotos, you're talking about, you have the noise extinction level and then a small set of code values above that is your signal. And you're trying to capture almost nothing, and then expand it into something that has something that you and I can appreciate. And we always had plenty of signal, when we were doing consumer imaging. It's a whole different ballgame, and some of my instincts were just wrong. And so I had to almost go back to ground and learn how to do the imaging. But I decided, that's what I wanted to do. And within 30 days, I bought my first telescope, my first astrophoto rig, and started trying to figure out how to put it together and do something with it.
That's your good friend right here,
That
right?
was my first telescope there. Within probably a week or two of that, I had everything working together, which I didn't know if that was good or bad because I didn't know what the experience was out there. That was my experience. And then I started capturing images. I was pretty excited by that, and they're horrible images. If you go to my website, every image I've ever captured is in there. You can see my first images.
So what was your first target? What did you decide was the first one worthy of
It was Lagoon Nebula ME, and I had just gotten the cameras working for the very first time. I had focused it during the daytime on some distant treetops. I had set up my gear, and it took me almost 3 hours to set it up and align it because I'd never done it before on one telescope. And I had calibrated my mount, and it's a computer go-to mount, so theoretically I could tell it to go to an object. So I knew that M8 was fairly bright, and I knew it was right to the south at that point in time. Suddenly, I had this image of the Lagoon Nebula on the software on the screen, like I'd never seen it before. I used to look at very big telescopes and never saw the detail I got in this one.
just the first frame?
Very first frame. I took a picture of that with my iPhone. Quickly sent it to my kids and everybody I knew, all excited. They were not impressed at all. But I was, because I saw more in that image than I've ever seen visually, and I was excited. So now that I got one frame, I told it to go and get 14 frames like that. And that night I got some free software that did some stacking, and I produced my very first image, and it was not in focus. It was bloated. It was not color. Even though I had a color camera, the signal I had was not color because I didn't know you had to debayer the image. I just had what I had, and I processed it. I'd done no calibrations because I didn't know how to do that. I had no guiding because I didn't know how to do that. And I created my first image, and technically now it's a pretty horrible image, but at the time I could see dark rifts that I never saw visually, these dark globules of dust accumulations. I was so excited by that, I couldn't wait to take my next image, and it was just one of those things where each picture was like an act of self-discovery. What am I going to get? What's it going to look like? How do I process this? And I started getting a slew of images, and and I have those on the website too. And you look at them, and they're terrible today. The color is terrible. They're over processed. I clipped the blacks. The stars have no color because I saturated them. I use Photoshop because that's all I knew how to use at the time. I didn't know how to use the more sophisticated tools, but I was making images. And when you make images, you get better at it. After a while, you start to develop your own look because every astrophotographer makes their own decisions on each step. And the cumulative nature of that is you and how you see your images.
So kind of used to call it the aim. And it sounds like this case, the aim is in the eye of the beholder because the aim isn't something you can calibrate against some standard.
That's true. I mean, in some cases, there's more correspondence with reality when I'm doing broadband images of galaxies. When I'm capturing red, green, blue, they're really red, green, blue, just like any digital camera would capture. And there's a way to calibrate that so that the colors you're getting back are true colors that your eye would see if it could see something that faint. But they're true. I mean, and it's a real color thing. But when you're doing narrowband imaging, where I'm cutting slices of 7 nanometer slices lined up on the excitation frequency of specific molecular gases in the universe, there's no right color. There's no wrong color. You just got 3 different filters. I have put together some kind of red, green, blue image. How will I choose to image that? That's completely up to you. There's some standards that people follow, or conventions, I should say, people follow. But it's up to you. What is it you're trying to do? Sometimes you're doing it to look pretty. Sometimes there's a feature that is subtle. Your goal is to be able to image that, bring it out better than other people have. And that was your whole goal for this image. And everything you did was leading up to capturing the right data and doing the right kind of processing and bringing out that subtle detail. So it sort of depends what you're trying to do, where you're trying to go. And there's images that I'm extraordinarily proud of. And people in the astro community and also in the astro community could care less about. And there's others that I thought were okay that have won awards. So sometimes it's hard to understand what an excellent image is and what causes people to think it's an excellent.
It sounds like a chili contest or a.
Yeah, in some ways that's true. Yeah, I've always said it as like giving talks to different groups. The interesting thing about this is the artistic aspect of what you add to it. If I took one data set, exactly the same data, I gave to 10 astrophotographers, I have no doubt I would get 10 very different very technically excellent images coming back that look completely different. And that's because everybody put themselves into that. And you tend to develop your own mind's eye of what you think you want your stars to look like, your nebula to look like, how you want it represented. For example, I think it's my color, my background in Kodak. I'm a high color guy, right? I like
Chroma.
yes, I bring the color. There's another school of thought in astrophotography that nothing in the universe is that bright and contrasty, and that's over processed. It's more natural to have it look low color and low contrast. But my point of view is none of this is natural.
You threw natural out the window long ago.
Yeah, I mean, your eye, if you were actually looking at this nebula, you're hovering in space and you're looking at this nebula, your eye probably wouldn't see it there either because it's so faint, right? It's only when you can accumulate, first off, you have a telescope that acts as a rain bucket, right, to catch photons. It focuses it down to a smaller area. Then the thing you're focusing it down on is a sensor, which has a unique ability to integrate over time longer than the eye can.
So you've moved here recently, but you had a great driveway setup. What made you decide to come here?
Well, I did have a driveway setup. Not sure it was great, but when I started to do astrophotography, that's where I was at night, and so that's where I had to do it. But we bought the property because it was lush and very tall trees, which at the time seemed like a great thing. Once you decided you want to do astrophotography, not so great. So I only had a strip of sky open at the driveway, basically. So I had about 3 hours of possible exposure time when something would rise beyond the eastern tree line and then finally set in the western tree line. And so that was pretty limiting, and that was a problem. Second problem was, got to set up in the driveway, which means if I have one telescope, I have to drag it out and physically put it together, line it with the sky, and all that takes time. When I first started, it took me hours to do for one scope. Then I got a second scope and a third scope. After a while, you get good at it. But still, even when I was doing it very efficiently, it was taking me maybe an hour and a half. And so there's a lot of effort that's going into each night. You want to take advantage of a clear sky. And so it's not just setup, but in the blurry hours of the morning, you're half asleep, you have to take it down. And because it was in the driveway, I didn't know if something was going to happen to it, whether a freak rainstorm comes in or a deer decides to walk through and trips on my cables or whatever. I had to sort of be up and about and keeping an eye on things. So that meant no sleep. And I thought, there must be a better way to do this. I really wanted to go from 3 scopes to 4, but setting up 4 in a driveway just seemed impossible. So I said, there's got to be a better way. I want to do an observatory. And the challenge there was not so much what would the design of the observatory be. The challenge there was, where would we build it? It would be worth building it on that property, unless you cut down these beautiful trees, which we were never going to do. So, I saw a lot of advantages if I could have an observatory.
So how long did you search, and where'd you end up? Obviously you ended up here.
We ended up here, but it took us a couple of years. And originally we were looking for a property that was maybe 5 to 10 acres in size, 30 minutes further south of the city into darker skies, someplace that had open horizons. And that's what we were looking for, and we spent a lot of time looking for it. And as we did that, we found things that were troubling. Like most of those places were flat farmer fields that were kind of bland and uninteresting and had no foliage on it, right? Neighbors could be a mile or 2 away. So we started to have this inkling that maybe what we were looking for isn't the right thing for us. And we started changing. We started looking for something closer to where we were, because if it wasn't for the trees, I was getting good images. Drive times would be similar, and maybe we could find a neighborhood where you're not so socially isolated. And that's what we started doing, and that's when we found this property. And it was a compromise, like most properties, but it had a hill in the back, it had fairly dark skies, fairly open skies. I was shielded from the adjoining properties. Might not be the optimal compromise for someone else at a different stage of their life, but it worked for us.
Very nice. So this is a unique building. The roof rolls off. I've often seen designs of observatories, which is the hemisphere on top on a silo-looking thing. This is clearly very different. So why this and not that?
Well, I think if you look in the Rochester area, there's probably, I'm going to guess, between 30 and 40 roll-off roof observatories.
Wow.
the traditional observatory you're thinking of, the dome, they can be quite expensive. And this kind of construction can be quite a bit less. It's not as exotic. There are cheaper versions of domes and smaller versions of domes, so they're starting to crop up more and more. But this was a pretty typical style, and most roll-off roof observatories that I'm aware of have one pier and one telescope in it, or maybe two at best. And so that would not have met my needs. And for me, because I have 4 telescopes that are gathering data from different targets, because we live in Rochester and because our skies are poor, when we have a clear night with no moon and no smoke, you have to grab your pixels, or your photons when the photons can be grabbed. And so my way of doing that is to run 4 scopes and gather as much data as possible while we can. And to run multiple scopes going after different targets, a roll-off design is actually pretty good.
So Pat, have you come up with a name for your observatory?
Yeah, I would have to say I put more effort into coming up with a name than the design of the observatory.
No way.
It was an obsession. I went through this sort of before because I decided to create my website and we called it cosgrovescosmos.com. But we didn't think we were going to call it that. We were looking for names, and I got everybody involved, and I had hundreds of names. And one I really kind of liked was it was Whispering Photons, and I liked it because when you think about it, there's this unique aspect to the universe. You can only see things because things glow, and they emit photons. When they emit photons, they go in all directions, and they travel until they're absorbed or somehow modified. And so the fact that we can see a galaxy that's 100 million light years away means those photons traveled all that distance and then ended up, in your sensor or absorbed.
And plus, there's nothing reflecting them, nothing refracting them. Initially, as they
right.
propagate through space, they're going 4 pi radians in every possible direction, and only the ones in this little tiny circle that
Right.
lines with your scope are the ones you can capture.
And conversely to that, if you're standing out in the night sky, you got a nice clear night, you're looking up, you see the stars. Right now, you're bathed in photons from every object that exists in the universe which is visible to us. Think about it. You literally are being bathed in a sea of photons that are coming in. But there's so few in many cases, you don't know that. And when you have a telescope and you're focused on a small part of the sky, you can tune into a stream of photons that happens to be coming probably from a target you're going after, probably from other sources between you and the target. But there's this idea that we're always being bathed in the sea of photons that are coming from all these objects in the universe.
A sea or a trickle?
Well, it's like a whisper, right? These are very faint, and for astrophotography, it's like you have to listen really well to try to capture those photons and tease them out of the background noise so you can see what emitted them. So I was always enamored with that ideation, and I was going to call the website the Whispering Photons. But I was told by others it just didn't sing, it wasn't simple, and one of the first suggestions made to me was Cosgrove's Cosmos. No one else had it, so okay, we're going with that. But I always liked the idea of the Whispering Photons. And so someone said, when you have your own observatory, you can call it whatever you want. You can call it Whispering Photons Observatory if you want. So now that I was going to build one, I started thinking about that, and I was afraid it wasn't quite right for the observatory, so I started ideating again. And this ideation went on for over a year, and I have friends and relatives who don't want to hear about it anymore because I would keep trying different names on it and things like that. And I was playing with the Whispering Photons theme, coming back to that after rejecting hundreds of other names. And at some point, I just landed on, Whispering Skies. That's what this observatory is about. It's trying to sample the thin string of photons that are coming in from the sky. And I like that.
Nice.
And I thought that would sort of work. And so I decided to go with that.
So one last final question before we wrap up. Do your neighbors have any idea what this is about?
The neighbors adjacent to us do because we told them, and we've offered them tours. Right?
Very good, very good.
Neighbors down the street probably didn't know it was even happening
No, even though they may have known that it was happening somewhere.
somewhere. Just didn't expect it to be down the street. Most people thought it was some kind of elaborate shed, and they didn't quite understand why it needed such an elaborate steel framework in the back, you know.
Yeah. What's that extra thing out back there?
Yeah,
what happened
what are
to
you
his
doing
roof?
with that? Yeah. Yeah, I think the first time I had the roof under power and it was opening, some neighbors probably, what's that, you know? So I've had questions, but we've talked to most of the neighbors, and they seem to know, what we're doing here, and we've been very open that if you want to come over and see the scopes or look through it.
Very cool. Well, this is the coolest thing in the neighborhood by far. And, thank you very much for taking the time with us today.
Thank you.
This was inspired by an observatory that was built in West Texas. It's known as the West Texas Observatory. It was a 4x4, 16-foot square observatory that 4 guys had built, and they all had one pier they owned in it, and they changed the cost of building it. And their design was a standard design that was being sold by one outfit that would run around the country and build these things. But it was built for like a desert climate. It had no real foundation, had shallow roofs, and the roofs rolled such that when you rolled the roof off of the building, if you had snow on it, it would roll right into the telescope room.
Yeah.
So we had to rotate it, increase the pitch, so I had to do a lot of changes to their design. But the idea of having 4 piers in a building that size, I hadn't seen that before. And when I saw that, that was my inspiration for doing what I did.
I just remember building the roll off at RIT, and what a nightmare that was.
Oh, I can imagine.
But it's a Quonset hut.
Right. So you have a curve there instead of the flats. But yes, that was a challenge. And then trying to find wheel hardware that would handle the loads and be long lived. And the V wheels we use, they were really wonderfully spec'd for our application. The only thing that worried me is they're relatively narrow. So we ended up having custom steel plates above that to help distribute the lateral loads. And Rick Albrecht, for those who don't know Rick is a very talented mechanical engineer who knows everything about photography, telescopes, and observatories. And every time I had a question, I ran it through him. When the engineer came back with a plan, it went through Rick, and he always steered me well. So I always felt like, because I'm not versed in these mechanical issues, and I needed to be. So he was my anchor.
It took Rick the first digital camera that he ever used. I remember carrying an IBM AT up that hill.
That was a heck of a hill, too.
1988, probably. Wow.
So the universe is very large. How do you decide what you're going to capture?
That's a really interesting question, because it used to be the biggest challenge I had to doing a night of imaging was getting everything set up and getting the weather to cooperate. Now with the observatory, I still have problems with getting the weather to cooperate, but now it's like, what do I want to go after? And that's not easy. It takes quite a bit of time and planning. And typically what I do is I look at what constellations are going to be on the eastern sky when we're getting dark, because I'm going to be tracing that. And then I start looking at star charts to find out what's in there. What have I shot? What have I not shot yet? There are some astrophotography sites online where you can sort by constellation. You look through, and maybe there's something in here I'm not familiar with. And there's a lot of catalogs of deep sky objects that you've never heard of and I've never heard of.
And now you can find them.
Yes, now
All day.
I can find it. Well, there's a lot of magical things, and one of the most magical things is plate solving. And plate solving, the telescope thinks it knows where it's pointing, but before it does anything, it takes a picture of the sky. A computer analyzes that, figures out the star pattern, and tells you where you're really pointing. Then it creates a calibration model, which it downloads, and now your pointing is very accurate. But when I'm getting ready to start an image, first thing it does is it slews to that image. Then it does a plate solve, and not only does it get the XY translation, it also gets the rotation right, so that my composition that I've laid out in advance is exactly what I want, and then make sure you can do that night after night repeatedly, right? But it's not easy, and I found there's a few catalogs that are not modern catalogs. There's one called the Sharpless catalog, and another called the ARP catalog. One is a catalog of bright luminous features in our sky, and the other one was galaxies that were grossly distorted because of tidal interactions between galaxies. So they tend to be interesting misfits in the sky. I often go there and say, okay, what's good in the sky? Is there an object here I should try to go after? And then the fact I have 4 telescopes with 4 different image scales, now I got to figure out which one fits what scope. And sometimes I'll have great objects for 3 of the scope. Like this is galaxy season. You don't see the Milky Way. You're really looking away from the Milky Way, which means you're looking out of the galaxy, which means you're only going to see other galaxies. That's why it's galaxy season. But that's great when you have long focal length. But my little telescope is 400 millimeters. What can I take a picture of when they're all tiny things to begin with? There's not a lot of magnification. So sometimes I really have to hunt. I would say that's one of my biggest challenges right now. Sometimes is choosing what targets I happen to go after in any given cycle. It's kind of fun searching though, and my Astro Man Cave has a pretty well situated astro library with a lot of catalogs and whatnot, and I spend a lot of time kind of researching, and that's kind of a pleasurable thing for me, so I don't mind doing that.
It's sure different from the old days of Kodak triacs.
Oh yeah,
when I did it back in the 60s.
Yeah, I was very active in astronomy in the 80s, and that's where I met Rick Albrecht and his dome. And at that point, I was doing TechPen 2713, if I remember right, technical film that was gas hypered. I gas hypered it myself. It would take you a week of preparation. First, you'd expose it to a vacuum and heat to get the moisture out, and you'd back flush it with hydrogen and nitrogen gas and raise the temperature to, get AGX sites which are exposed. And then you had to freeze it until you used it, and then you had to thaw it out, and you'd have 1 frame of film, and you'd take a picture, and the guiding of the scope was you at an eyepiece looking at a crosshair with a paddle for 4 to 6 hours on 1 frame. And then usually at the end of that is when the plane goes through the frame and destroys all of your work and you start again. I did that and my results were horrible. But in the digital age where you're doing many shorter exposures that you stack, and if a plane comes through, you could throw out that one. But actually today we don't even do that. We just have, when we integrate things, we have a statistical process that basically rejects pixels from one frame, which weren't reinforced by the other frames. Digital is a wonderful
like
thing for
moments of good seeing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And planetary is a very different thing, but that's the whole game on planetary. You're taking high-speed video because every once in a while the atmosphere settles down, you get a crisp image. You may have 100,000 video frames and maybe end up with 500 that were in those moments of tranquility, and you stack those together. But the methodologies in digital for someone with a background of Kodak playing with these things for years and years and years, so much fun. And that's what this is about. I'm retired now. This is my fun, and my wife has been very accommodating as I've done this. But as I tell other people, there's a lot of people who retire and they go out and buy an expensive fishing boat. This is my fishing boat, and I fish stars. 4 motors, maybe.
So what's the typical exposure of each individual?
So it depends if it's broadband or narrowband, because narrowband throws away so much light. I usually do 5-minute subs for the narrowband. That works out really well. And 90-second subs for broadband, where I have more photons coming in. And I like to get 15 hours total. I often am shut down by the weather rather than my willpower. You know, and what will happen is you can only image when you have no moon. So there's maybe a week and a half period, and hopefully it's clear, and hopefully there's no forest fire smoke coming over your area. And then you try to shoot it, and maybe you don't get all those days. Maybe
So
you
you
get
can
two or
really
three.
see that forest? I've
Oh,
seen forest fire smoke on a rare occasion, but
Well, we've had it like 2 years ago. We had yellow skies in the daytime. At night, you couldn't see anything. But
wow.
that was another reason I wanted an observatory, because I had friends who had observatories, and what they would do is they had very thin smoke, and you couldn't tell by eye, but it definitely impacted. You basically any of the fainter parts of the nebulosity just were gone.
Okay.
But what they would do is they would shoot all night, and then they might throw out half the images because maybe the wind shifted and suddenly there was gone. It wasn't worth the trouble of 3 hour setups to do that for me, so I couldn't do it. But they could just roll off a roof and start working. So that was another reason to have the observatory, is you can take more marginal nights and go for it. And hopefully we are going to go into the forest fire season. It will impact us again, I'm sure. And I'll have more opportunities to work around the clouds that way, and try to pull off something.
So 5 minutes per, and you total of 15 hours. So that's multiple nights, right?
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah. That's why you have to, every night you start, you're going to have to recenter the scope, both from an XY and a rotational basis. And then of course, while you're taking one sub to the other, you dither the capture. You don't want it too precise, because you don't want a star lining up on an edge of a pixel consistently. It'll create its own interference pattern, right? So you nudge every exposure a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. And then when you put it together, you register them. You have to register each image so all the stars are lined up. But that
That's
actually,
kind of black magic.
well, it's a good technique because it's kind of a super resolution thing.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, when you're really going for sharp detail, the Hubble Space Telescope started this thing called dither processing, or drizzle processing, excuse me, where you basically are using that same idea that you're doing a super resolution computation. So you can end up with an image which has twice the physical dimension, or 3 times, and it interpolates and gives you more sharpness. But the other thing that's really become a very powerful tool is, when you think about any optical system, you know that there are things which are causing your image to defocus. And in astronomy, we have these wonderful thing called stars, right? They're ideal points, but that's not what you captured. But you can characterize the actual shape of the distortion, which means you mathematically can remove that. And it's not a sharpening; it's a sharpness restoration. And they've gotten very, very good at that. And so between the various techniques, you can pull out more detail than you should. So resolution is, a function of focal length, but it's also a function of the diameter, right? Which my new Galaxy scope is twice the diameter of my other ones, just for that purpose, right? But with all these techniques, it's amazing the amount of detail you can get. And for me, I'll capture these images, I'll process them, and sometimes I'm shocked at what I'm seeing. And then I see other things in the background. What's that? So once I've gathered the main target, I start looking at what else is in the neighborhood. And that can be a fascinating exploration too. I have as much fun doing that as doing the front end.
What's the sweet spot for an F number of a scope? And if you get too small, you get diffraction, right? But as you
Right.
get bigger, you get aberrations.
Yeah, I would say that
With a digital camera, right, you tend to think f5.6 is kind of being a sweet spot for most
I
people.
would say that most people would say that f5 is a good point to be. F5, f5.5. That's not true for planetary. They're doing like f30, right? That's a whole different ballgame. But for deep sky, f5 is good. There are optical systems that are running f2, but it's so wide field, it's suitable for a certain kind of target that you're going after. And those optical systems require you to have the camera mounted in the front of the telescope on the secondary. So you have cables sort of in the light path, which can get a little funky and cause artifacts in your images. But there's all kinds of exotic optical systems now that are doing amazing things. Oh,
I know you publish in your notes, right, some of your images. Do you ever connect up with folks that are doing research in areas and go, hey, look at what I found and.
it sort of happened indirectly. I publish on my webpage, I
Yeah.
publish in magazines, and I've been contacted by people asking if they could use the image or something like that. But the one that was probably most interesting to me was I had one image that I was most proud of because it was published to every magazine that I submitted to. So it was a grand slam. And it was the first time that it was ever chosen for NASA's APOD, which is astro picture of the day.
Picture of the day. Yeah.
What's fascinating about that is they choose it. Then they tell you a few days ahead of time saying, hey, here's the write-up. Look at it. Tell us if we got anything wrong about how you captured this. But then it's described by a professional astrophysicist. And then there's a sort of a chat room behind it where astrophysicists from all over the world are debating what they're seeing in the image. And that was my favorite part of getting selected. And there was questions. I don't know how this guy caught this, but you see the shadow bands he's getting here. And I said, I captured it. And so it was a lot of fun. As an amateur doing this, but there was something they thought were showing some interesting features that they hadn't seen. And that was why it got the attention. I captured it in a way to bring out faint outer shell details most people don't try to capture. And I did. And so they were seeing things of interest. So
Fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. You're talking about the airplane going on. It reminds me of Rick Albrecht's famous picture of the DC-10.
yes.
Flying in front of the moon.
Yep.
I think it was. Yeah.
Yep.
And he actually tracked down what flight it was.
Yeah, he did. Well, that's Rick, right?
Any questions from folks online? Remember, you're on mute, so you'll have to unmute before you answer. All right, then. Any other questions here? If not, thank you very much, Pat, for coming and showing us.
Thank you, Wayne. You did the bulk of the work here.
So you know John Hayes?
Don't know that name.
He's
Very good. Thank you all for
he's in
joining.
Tucson.
Good night.
And,